Game publishers increasingly desire to tie you into their games for the long term. The long slow power grind of games like Destiny and The Division keep players coming back day after day, week after week, gladfully sinking unspeakable hours into their games, and as a no doubt pleasing result for publishers, are quite happy to buy the game at launch, purchase DLC and expansion packs, plus the occasional delve into the game's marketplace to part with real world money for a pretty cosmetic. One repeated problem with these games though has been weak storytelling, using the excuse that the plot is merely there to carry the game along and the real story is what the player does. To readdress that, EA enlisted BioWare, creators of the beloved Mass Effect series, to create a living world that not only keeps players coming back but also delivers the sort of story they are renowned for. One of the most respected developers jumping into a hot genre? What could possibly go wrong? Well, plenty as it turns out. Welcome to Midlife Gamer's review of Anthem. This review was originally written by the wonderful Matt Jones and has been adapted to video by me, CJ. The world Anthem inhabits is one of the most beautiful I've ever seen. Luscious trees and vegetation sway in the breeze, waterfalls flow down cliff faces, particle effects flood the screen seemingly at all times, and draw distances give an impressive illusion of a vast scale. Your first visit into the open world is a genuine breathtaker, and one of those moments that reinforces how far gaming has come in terms of visuals. As an opening statement, it's impressive. This goes up a notch the first time you take to the skies, because Anthem really nails traversing the world. A simple button press is all that's needed to engage your boosters, and then you're doing your best Iron Man impression, cutting through the air and taking in everything below you. Flying too long overheats your javelin, which leaves you in freefall to the ground. Thankfully there's no drop damage. However, you can reset the heat gauge by flying through a waterfall or diving into a lake. Flying close to shallow water, such as a stream or a pond, adds a cooling buff, which slows down the gauge. Initially, overheating was a frustration, but later I came to appreciate the constant need for water, adding a more interesting mechanic to movement instead of it simply being a case of moving from A to B. As a whole, it works really well, and seeing the world from a high vantage point is a joy. In fact, movement in general is one thing that Anthem does well. Something as simple as sprinting feels weighty and purposeful, with a brief moment of delay and a judder reinforcing the graphical cues of boosters engaging on the back of your javelin. Similarly, dodging during combat feels excellent, and escaping from a tough spot with a swift dodge and fly maneuver feels fantastic. While the movement in combat feels superb, the combat itself is less successful. Guns feel weak, taking multiple clips to take down low tier enemies. Using weapons feels like a strange juxtaposition to movement, the swift and enjoyable darts across play spaces being tempered by plodding gameplay. The Division was criticised for bullet sponge enemies, but they have nothing on what you see here. Straight up ordnance isn't the only tool at your disposal though, and realistically the focus during enemy encounters is on using your javelin's two choosable skill items instead. These generally take shape in a grenade of some form and a more devastating attack on the other. Pair these up correctly by yourself or with a teammate and you can land a combo attack that deals significant damage. While it's undoubtedly satisfying to land a combo, it does start to feel slightly monotonous when every encounter turns into you waiting for the skills to recharge. Damage output isn't the only issue with weapons though, the other being the general lack of them. In fact, for a looter shooter there's a lack of loot in general, and this is one of the serious flaws in the game. In the early game, you're stuck with 2 or 3 variations of 9 weapon archetypes, none of which feel distinctive enough from each other. As you progress through the common, uncommon, rare and epic tiers of guns, it's the same guns all the way through, which really kills the excitement of seeing a drop on the floor. In addition to the lack of weaponry, there's also a lack of armor drops. Well, there's actually none at all. For some reason, armor variations do not exist in the loot pool. There's 2 ways to change how your character looks, either changing the shader and material type, or by buying an armor set from the store. You can purchase these either with currency you earn in-game or with microtransactions. While the in-game currency doesn't exactly fly up, there's enough sources for you to be able to afford the cosmetics without too much stress, so digging your credit card out doesn't feel necessary. There's little in the way of mission structure too, essentially distilling down to 3 identikit mechanics. Fly to an area and either A. stand in the spot shooting everything while a bar goes up, B. collect fragments and return them to a specific position while being shot, or C. fly around collecting orbs and return them to a specific position while being shot. I understand that essentially every game could be boiled down to a basic level, but this just adds a further level of monotony to a game that already feels tedious. It's dull missions placed on top of dull gameplay with added dull weapons. There's not much to do in general. After the short campaign, you have 3 things to do: contracts, strongholds and free play. Contracts are little more than shorter missions with nothing interesting added aside from occasional legendary versions that seem a bit harder. Strongholds are Anthem's versions of something that sits between Destiny's strikes and raids. They're longer, multi-sectional missions. There's 3 strongholds in Anthem currently, 2 being new and 1 simply being a repeat of the campaign's last mission. I enjoyed these at first, but there's so few they start to grate, especially with one of the weekly challenges being to do them 10 times, and a questline that requires you to complete a whopping 25. Free play has its own set of issues. Essentially a free roam mode, you can explore the map at your heart's content. The problem is there's not a lot to do, and what you can do isn't particularly easy to do. The map itself is confusing to navigate, with large walls often stopping your planned route, and absolutely no waypoints or guidance system to help you get to a destination. The world, despite being beautiful, is indistinct, with little variation between the regions. In free play, you have activities called events, but they don't appear on your map. You just have to fly around the space and hope that the game deems it time to kick one off. It's a repeated criticism levelled at games as service titles that at launch there's a limited amount of activities, but Anthem shortchanges you to an incomparable degree. Exacerbating all of this is one of the poorest cast of enemies in time. None of the enemy factions are particularly interesting, and the variations in all those factions are incredibly few. Not only that, the majority are beyond stupid, merely standing in one place while you're forced to pump endless bullets into them. Even the boss type enemies are utterly dull. At the end of most missions, you're asked to take down a targeted enemy, which are essentially exactly the same thing that you've just been shooting for the last however long, but they've got a different name and a frankly obscene amount of health shield points. Even the Titans, the behemoths that were seen often pre-release, are exceedingly dull to fight, doing nothing but spam some incredibly cheesy distance attacks, including balls of fire that give you a split second to avoid and leave you immediately with no shield and a sliver of health, while waiting for the brief moments where their crit spots are open, so you can whittle down at a health bar that overstays its welcome. The end game fares no better than the rest. It's simply doing the same stuff you've done at 3 increasing difficulties, and there's less structure to it. Nothing new, no variations, just even longer health bars. There's other curious decisions throughout too. For example, you're unable to change anything mid-mission. Your loadout is set before you head out, and this can have negative consequences, such as wasting space bringing a weapon that has no effect on a boss. BioWare has always been lauded for its storytelling, packing plots, subplots and minor threads throughout their worlds. It pains me to say that none of this exists in Anthem. The main storyline is so immediately forgettable. The minor optional conversations that take place in Fort Tarsis are no more than distraction, and have a distinct whiff of just being there to give the hub a reason to exist. You're often presented with dialogue options, something that in Mass Effect games could have strong implications in how the rest of the game played out, but here, they add nothing. The main story arc, aside from being forgettable, is also so generic and by the book, it's almost unimaginable that this came from the studio that created Mass Effect. Big, faceless villain with generic name seeks item to get unimaginable power and destroy stuff. If you're thinking you've heard that one before, you're right. There's absolutely nothing added to a tale you've played before, aside from one cutscene that stands out like a beacon in 15 hours of utter banality. There's a theme that keeps coming back to the forefront in this review, and it's lack. There's a lack of things to do, there's a lack of story, there's a lack of loot, there's a lack of mission mechanics. It adds up to me entirely lacking the motivation to continue playing it. It's inexcusable that both EA and BioWare haven't looked at every single misstep made by games like The Division and Destiny, and instead of learning and rectifying, somehow delivered less than the total sum of those games. Despite both of those games being much flawed and being rightly called out as such, they were immeasurably better games at launch than Anthem. Anthem is probably the most disappointed I've ever been with a game. On paper it ticks all the boxes, but then goes on to deliver so little. A jaw-dropping environment can't save a looter shooter with dull, unimaginative loot and lackluster shooting, monotonous combat mechanics, and a weak and unmemorable plot that whimpers along to an unsatisfactory conclusion. For a studio once held in such high regard but needing a hit after a weakly received previous game, it's a spectacular miss. So what did you think of Anthem? Leave us a comment below with your thoughts and visit midlifegamer.net for more reviews and articles.